as well, and I'll tell you a little more about myself than what we just kind of covered. So like I said, my major here was history, and my focus was kind of in medieval history. I really loved it. Believe it or not, UNM actually has a really solid medieval studies program, despite it being located in the middle of the desert in the United States. But pretty cool. So, like Daniel said, my past involvement with Cafe over the years ago, it was 2013, I think. I was a director for a semester here and was involved in stuff with Ralph, who was also a former director. I worked at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History Foundation doing accounting and development, which just recently ended as of yesterday. But that's because I'm starting a new job at St. John Vianney Church as the Director of Development and Program Manager. So I'm still not quite sure exactly what that means, but I'm working on it. So like I said as well, my background in music, it's kind of weird. It's not very conventional how I got started on this sort of thing. I used to play my guitar and sing and stuff like that as a part of our church choir at Immaculate Conception back in 2011. And we got this awesome new priest come in, Father Huff, who, if any of you guys have hung out with me for like more than 10 minutes, you know that he made a huge impact on my life because I talk about him all the time. But yeah, I mean, he came in 2011 and, we wanted to start up a youth group together and kind of worked on some stuff together. And as we were moving through this stuff, we'd go up into the choir loft and Ralph and I would go play our guitars up there and strum away and sing our stuff. And he would let us do that. And every now and then he'd kind of suggest, like, hey, let's put in an antiphon or a Gregorian chant here. And we were so neutral to the whole thing, we had no idea what that was. So we'd go, okay, that's cool. So we'd put that in there and keep the other stuff going. And then a couple more months would pass. He'd say, let's put an offertory chant in there. Okay, that's fine. Like, no worries. So then, started doing that for a couple months, keep going. And eventually he's like, well, hey, instead of an entrance processional, why don't we put in the entrance antiphon, the entrance Gregorian chant? Sure, whatever. And so within the course of probably 6 months, I went from guitar strumming dude with dreadlocks down my back and ears stretched to up in the choir loft doing Gregorian chant. And we didn't really know what happened. I still don't really know what happened, but it's a fun story. Anyway, so that was kind of my first kind of primer in Gregorian chant. I took piano when I was a kid, so normally you have musicians coming into vocalizing or singing, and they have a background in some sort of instrument. So, they can look at sheet music and know, like, this is an F and this is a whatever, and this is how it fits in. Gregorian chant is not like that at all. All the pitches and everything are totally relative to one another, and it stacks on top of each other without getting too deep into it. Anyway, long story short, it was kind of unconventional how I got involved in it. So from that, our choir kind of began to travel around the Archdiocese and sing at different parishes as was asked of us. We sang at Our Lady of Sorrows for a little while with Father Stephen Barada, if any of you know him. And we had a musical director there who actually knew notes. He ended up moving away, so we had nobody who actually knew notes, which was exciting for a little while. And then de facto, once our other director left, I just kind of became the director. Don't ask me how, it just kind of happened. And so the group that we sing with now, we've advanced over the past 5 years in our Gregorian chant and understanding the notes and in understanding each other. So I'd say we're in a much different place, as you would probably agree, than we were 5 years ago. So that group I sing with here in Albuquerque is called Vox Peregrina, which in Latin translates into English as the voice of the pilgrim, because we are kind of a pilgrim nomad choir that travels around aimlessly with some aim. And I also, like I said at the beginning as well, I also sing with this group in Santa Fe called the Schola Cantorum of Santa Fe. We do mainly polyphonic pieces, so multi-layered chants, and that was an amazing experience. I've had a workshop with Father Columba Kelly, who's this Benedictine monk out of St. Meinrad's Arch Abbey in Illinois, who was doing Gregorian chant in English before it was cool. Now it's really cool to do it. But he was doing it back in the 70s when those were fighting words. I also did a workshop this past summer in Ireland with Anuna, who is Ireland's national choir. We did things like the Anuna technique, and again, without getting too deep into that. So I wouldn't say I'm the most well-versed in this sort of thing, but I think as a historian, as somebody who loves the church, as somebody who's reasonably involved in this sort of thing, It's helped me a lot, and I hope to help you in that same way. And the church has answers to these sorts of things. So the essence of my talk today is that not all music was created equal. Not all music played in a church, created for a church, is created equal. And so, just by name, sacred music, there's something different about that. Something different than just religious music, something different than gospel music, sacred music. And we've probably heard this point a million times, that the word sacred, there's something inherent to that word, right? Sacred means set apart. So the church has an idea, has a firm and concrete definition of what sacred music is and how it's applied. And so firstly, to understand what the church means by sacred music, we have to turn to a document written in 1967 during the Second Vatican Council called Musicam Sacram, or as it translates into English, sacred music. So here in Musicam Sacram, the Council Fathers write, "By sacred music it is understood that which, being created for the celebration of divine worship, is endowed with a certain holy sincerity of form." A certain holy sincerity of form. So here we can see that the Council is establishing a sort of framework that understands sacred music created specifically for divine worship, which is different and distinct from merely secular songs or other hymns and tunes that have kind of been modified or adapted to accommodate divine worship. And that's a difference to be made, right? We're not accommodating divine worship. Rather, this is facilitating divine worship. This becomes divine worship. And I want to emphasize too, I want to focus on the word holy there. It's holy sincerity of form. And John Paul II speaks to this as well. He wrote a chirograph in 2003. It's kind of like an encyclical sort of thing. He wrote an chirograph on sacred music in 2003, and he quotes Pope Paul VI in that. So again, Pope Paul VI, who was alive and pushed forward the Second Vatican Council during 1967. John Paul II quotes him in 2003 in saying that not all without distinction that is outside the temple is fit to cross into the threshold. So crossing the threshold. And he actually uses the Latin word profanum for outside the temple. And profanum sounds like the word profane, right? That's the root of the word profane, because they essentially mean the same thing. Outside the temple, secular, profane, is not worthy for what is inside the temple. What is sacred, has a certain holy sincerity of form. So moving on from the same council, we hear this text. That the musical tradition of the universal church is a treasure of inestimable value. Inestimable value. Greater than that of any other art. The main reason for this preeminence is that, as sacred song united to the words, it forms a necessary or integral part of the solemn liturgy. A necessary integral part. And I think this is an important point, because I think, especially in modern times, particularly in the Roman Church, and that's just a little aside, that's what I'm speaking to here. I wish I was more well-versed on the Eastern rites and their musical understanding, but I think a lot of this stuff, especially from the Second Vatican Council, applies to both rites. But later on, when I speak more about like Pius X's reformation of music, that obviously would apply to the Roman Church, because they didn't have a lot of the problems that we have nowadays. I'm jealous. But anyway, so back to this. So that sacred song is united to the words and forms a necessary integral part of the solemn liturgy. Okay, so this is important because today I think we have this conception of sacred music as this set of hymns out of this book that, like God bless him, the choir directors who's been there for 50 years or whatever, the ancient choir directors kind of threw together like 5 minutes before the Mass has begun or whatever. And they're kind of haphazardly chosen or something like that. And that's kind of more or less how sacred music is perceived of today. But what this is saying here is that it becomes an integral part of the solemn liturgy. And that's because if you look at stuff like Gregorian chant, like these chants of the church, this historic tradition, the musical tradition of the church, she doesn't have hymns as we understand them today. She has texts that are from the Psalms, that are from the Gospel, that are from a lot of the readings, that fit into the liturgy because they were specifically chosen for the liturgy, that have been set into plain song or chant form. So these texts, these pieces, play into the entire liturgy as a whole rather than just a section or a part of the liturgy. And so, especially here, what's interesting is the question that I kind of came up with as I was reading this text is, why does Vatican II place so much emphasis on the musical tradition of the universal church? Why is that? And so what I was thinking about as well is that this musical tradition, it's not merely a flourish on top of the liturgy. It's not merely like an unnecessary additive to the liturgy, but that it's essential to the nature of what liturgy is, like as the church understands it, in the mind of the church. It's essential to it rather than just a flourish to make it even contemporary. Like if we're talking contemporary to Mozart, right? Like even somebody like this would even say that was probably not supposed to happen. That it's not something that's contemporary. It's not merely a flourish. The liturgy, in essence, that this is an essential part of the nature of liturgy. Got a lot of quotes. Because this isn't I want to emphasize with my quotes that this isn't just merely like my kind of speculation. This isn't merely just me being like, yes, I sing in these choirs and I do this stuff, and so therefore we should all do this. The quotes are here to emphasize that this is something that's important that the church actually has a teaching on. So moving on from here, this is what I was referring to a little bit earlier. Pope Pius X in 1903 wrote an encyclical called, that's difficult for me to pronounce, Tra le Sollecitudini. And basically this encyclical is looked to, especially now, but I mean during the time and context, there was a lot of like crazy masses that had like these gigantic orchestras that would play these like glorias that lasted like half an hour. There was a joke that somebody had told me a couple of years ago that prior to the council, that the Gloria was so long that it's a reverend joke, but the priest would actually be able to finish his Gloria because the priest would say his Gloria, and he'd walk out and go have a smoke and then come back and the Gloria would be finishing. These very extravagant, very embellished, very flourished sort of musical pieces that people would go to, especially during like the Renaissance. People would go to these things not in order to connect themselves to liturgy, not in order to worship God, but to listen to the pieces. And that's why I think today, even still, we kind of carry this mentality with us when we see these, not that they're not beautiful, I think they're absolutely beautiful, but we have these big concerts and stuff that sell out, whatever, and people decontextualize what the texts are. So that's what this encyclical is written for. So pulling from this encyclical, Pope Pius X writes that sacred music should consequently possess, in the highest degree, the qualities proper to the liturgy, and in particular the sanctity and goodness of form, which will spontaneously produce the final quality of universality. And again, I'm just going to ping on this little word of form. They keep referring to the word form, that there's an essential form of liturgy. There's an essential form of this. There's a goodness of form. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But yeah, so proper liturgy, the highest qualities proper liturgy, sanctity, holiness, and goodness of form. Universality, though. Why universality? Why does that matter, right? I mean, as we all probably already know, that the word Catholic means universal. And there's a certain sense to it that's, like if I go to Mass here at the Newman Center, or if I, go to Mass in Florida or in like Rome, assuming that it's the same day, all the texts of like the readings in the Gospel, properly speaking, will be the same. So we have that sense of universality to it. But even in terms of hymns, this is how much that he's asking for this universality to go. Is that, sometimes you go to one place and they'll do more traditional hymns or more contemporary hymns or more this or more that, depending on where it is, and they'll add some things here and whatever. But what he's drawing upon is that the Gregorian chants, the text of the Mass, is that these were texts of the Mass, not merely just nice pieces to reflect upon or to have echo in the church because it has good acoustics or whatever. These were essential parts of the Mass. And so being such, I could go to Mass in Rome, I could go to Mass in the Ukraine, right, in Ukraine, I could go to Mass in Spain, I could go to Mass in Florida, here in New Mexico, wherever. And the essential form of this will be the same, right? We'll still have, maybe the chants won't be done as well in some places, but the essence of the chants, the essence of the texts are still there. It never goes away. And we can even still see that, like today, I mean, even in like the Novus Ordo, the reform of the Mass after the Second Vatican Council, if you've ever gone to Mass with Father Garcia at the Newman Center, he'll read the entrance antiphon before the Mass begins, and that would be chanted normally. But he reads it as still, because it's still an essential part of the Mass, right? So that's what that is. That's what the entrance antiphon would be. But the universality, that he's focusing on how these sorts of things flow together, proper liturgy, sanctity and goodness of form, and that all those things, sanctity, goodness of form, all that stuff produces universality. That having those texts, having that understanding, having that form, the essential form, produces a universal sense to who we are as Catholics. Okay. So why, and this is kind of an interesting, probably dumb question, but why beauty? It's why do we have to have beauty in the church? And so beauty is inherent to the worship of the church. Beauty is who she is. She's beautiful because the heavenly Jerusalem is beautiful. And we read back to Revelation chapter 21, verse 2, where St. John says, I also saw a holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Now verses 10 to 11, he says, He took me in spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. It gleamed with the splendor of God. Its radiance was like that of a precious stone, like jasper, clear as crystal. And he goes on and talks about the gates of Jerusalem and the statues of the 12 apostles. It's all very ornate, very beautiful. He talks about the glimmering gold, even on the hand of the individual who's writing. So beauty is inherent to who she is, because we hear oftentimes the church referred to as the New Jerusalem, as God's kingdom, as all this stuff. And drawing those principles to their natural conclusion that the church is beautiful. Not even in like this ethereal kind of distant sense, spiritual sense, but also in a very real sense. We're human beings who, we don't add any glory to the church by the things that we do. The church is always going to be who she is, right? But we help ourselves, we help our understanding of this, we help our conception of this, because we're fallen human beings who, if it's not shiny, I'm not going to pay as much attention to it, unfortunately. And that's kind of what, we need beauty. We need beauty for ourselves. I know this is really difficult to read, but I really like the picture, because for any of you guys who have been to Rome, and if you even haven't, this is totally recognizable as St. Peter's Basilica. This isn't even like, this was edited to look like this. That's actually how it looks. Like, just that radiant, that much splendor. And we don't add anything to the liturgy with that, right? We don't add anything to the liturgy with that. That's to help us understand why it is. Why do people freak out and all this stuff when they walk inside St. Peter's Basilica? Why is it that the Pope has such an impact on a lot of people and stuff? And, if he was just a guy walking around in like, a suit or, a polo and jeans or whatever, it's like, we could still be like, yes, he's the Pope, but a lot of that stuff is for us, to help us understand his office and who he is. So here is actually a quote that says, beauty is important because there is an inherent connection between the senses and what we perceive as beautiful and the spirit. There's an inherent sense to this. And referencing probably one of my favorite people on earth, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, soon to be Pope Benedict XVI. He wrote this awesome book. I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested, The Spirit of Liturgy. He has an entire section on music and liturgy. And so he says here, he's talking about music, and he says, the music that draws senses into spirit, and so brings man to wholeness. It does not abolish the senses, but inserts them into a unity of this creature that is man. It elevates the spirit precisely by wedding it to the senses, and it elevates the senses by uniting them with the spirit. Read that last part again. It elevates the spirit precisely by wedding it to the senses, and it elevates the senses by uniting them with the spirit. I thought that was powerful, because Oftentimes I think especially in a lot of different circles, we hear this kind of dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual, that there's this deep separation between the two. I think a lot of it comes from Protestant America and our Protestant past as a nation, where, this stuff is bad, this is all bad, this is all bad, this is horrible, and, this is detrimental to my spirit. What he's saying here is that these two are wedded together. You can't separate the physical and the spiritual, that there's this inherent connection between the two. That beauty is not just beauty as such, right? There's this inherent connection with our spirit there. And so even, Hans Urs von Balthasar, I found this really interesting link that paraphrased him. And he essentially says that without beauty, the truth does not persuade and goodness does not compel. Without beauty, truth does not persuade, nor goodness does not compel. And so beauty, not only in architecture, not only in nice things we can look at, but also in how we do liturgy and what we do in the liturgy, right? So beauty as expressed in the church's liturgy synthesizes diverse elements into a unified whole, the universal aspect, right? Truth, goodness, and the human impulse to worship. And, I'm going to reference another Pius X quote, but I'll save that one. Yes, it's totally fine to say that you prefer one type of music to another, right? Like, that's just how we are as humans. Like, I was listening to Black Sabbath on the drive over here, or, techno or whatever, right? Like, that's fine to prefer a certain type of music to another. But music for the liturgy is inherent to the liturgy. It's of a special, set-apart, sacred nature. So personal preference, as venerable as it can be, unless you listen to Black Sabbath, personal preference is unfortunately not criterion. That's not sufficient criterion to say, yes, this is appropriate for liturgy, right? I joke with Father Scott quite a bit because he likes Led Zeppelin, but we always say that that would, as much as he likes to listen to it, that would never be appropriate for the liturgy, for the Mass. Just because he likes it does not give it sufficient criterion for the Mass. And moving on here, maybe. Somehow. Hopefully. Okay, there we go. And I love this quote. So it says here, make an examination of conscience so that the beauty of the music and hymnody will return once again to the liturgy. It is necessary to purify worship of ugliness of style, careless forms of expression, ill-prepared music and texts, which are not worthy of the great act that is being celebrated. And this is kind of this is a pithy quote. It's awesome, I read this the first time and I was like, wow, this must have been from like Pius X in that awesome encyclical, or this was from one of these big, great reforming popes. And he was a reforming pope, absolutely. But it's not somebody you would expect. It was our great friend John Paul II who said this quote. I'm going to read this again in that context. He asked musicians in 2003, to make an examination of conscience so that the beauty of music and hymnody will return once again to the liturgy. It is necessary to purify worship of ugliness of style, careless forms of expression, ill-prepared music and texts, which are not worthy of the great act that is being celebrated. I think that's pretty cool. So why Gregorian chant? Well, this is a really easy answer that has already been answered for you all. Again, in that awesome encyclical where Pius X is speaking against these really Baroque masses that are just totally, long and last 3 hours, 4 hours. So he writes in that encyclical that Gregorian chant is the supreme model of all sacred music. The supreme model, the form, the essential form, the essential nature. I want to emphasize that there's this vein of liturgy, right? There's this vein of sacredness, of solemnity. And with Gregorian chant, we tap into that vein. We tap into that solemnity. It is almost like a Platonic form. It really is. The way they speak about this is almost like the Platonic form of liturgy. The Platonic form of sacred music is Gregorian chant. I'm going to keep hammering this point home because I love it. So moving on again. So this is from Pius X. This one actually is from Pius X. He says, when music follows movement, inspiration, and savors a Gregorian form, the more sacred and liturgical it becomes. The more out of harmony it is with that supreme model, the less worthy it is of the temple. That's good. Isn't that good? That's good. Ooh. So again, Gregorian form, he just flat out says it. He says there's essential form. And that the closer we move into that Gregorian form, the more we move with the Gregorian form, the more we take the tones. I was talking to Father Chris earlier about the different tones of Gregorian chant. But the more we move into that essential form, the more we use those tones as who we are as a church, right? The more sacred and liturgical it becomes. The more we tap into that vein. And the more out of harmony it is with it, the less worthy it is of the temple, right? Going back again to that other quote we were reading earlier about the sacred and the profane. What is profane, profanum, cannot be brought into the temple. It is not worthy of the temple.
Can you clarify that point in terms of understanding the inspiration for the architecture of early Catholic churches and how they derived their structure from Roman administration buildings? How there was an inner part that was separated by a wall, a barrier, a veil,
yes.
And that's where all of the official businesses of the empire were conducted. And then on the other side of that was where sort of the profane, people milled about, people conducted their casual business there.
I would say yes and no to that. No, that doesn't quite answer that. I would just hate to dive off on the side of architecture at this point, but essentially, yes, what you're saying is true. That just a brief aside on architecture, you see things like like Our Lady of Perpetual Help has a big, beautiful iconostasis that separates the sacred, the sanctuary, literally with that sanctuary, right, the holy place, from everything else, right, from the world. And the priest, Father Chris, would enter into that sanctuary as the high priest, as in persona Christi, as the person of Christ, right? Same thing for the Roman rite. We have the sanctuary that's elevated. It used to have an altar rail, and in some places had something similar to an iconostasis as the rood screen. But yeah, as an aside, yes, that does play a role in it. But I just hate to, get too much into what that role exactly is. Yes. So sacred and profane, that we begin to tap into that kind of sacred vein. And this was a cool one as well. Oh wait, actually, okay, there's a reason why that came up too. So actually what's neat too about that quote, that really rough, awesome quote about tapping into the Gregorian form, that was also quoted by John Paul II. John Paul II quoted Pius X in 2003 when he was speaking to musicians in St. Peter's Basilica. So it's not as old or as pre-Vatican II or whatever as a lot of people tend to think. That it's stuff that's still a part of the mind of the church and the practice of the church. Moving on from there, you see this quote. An authentic updating of sacred music can take place only in the lineage of the great tradition of the past, the Gregorian chant and the sacred polyphony. And again, I left this one unquoted because it sounds like another one of those quotes that's from a while ago, from just one of those amazing popes. And he is an amazing pope. He's my favorite pope, Pope Benedict XVI. He said this in the Sistine Chapel in 2006. There was a concert put on for his honor by Domenico Bartolucci. So they put on a concert for him, and at the end he gave this address where he spoke about what sacred music is and why it's important, right? And that the essence of it can only take place. Sacred music, he says, can only take place in the great tradition of the past. Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony. So moving on from here, what is Gregorian chant? I've been throwing that term around quite a bit. And so without getting too technical, and I'm really going to try just not get too technical here, Gregorian chant, the origins of which are kind of foggy. they're kind of foggy. But it kind of began to emerge around some reforms that centered around the 7th century, the 8th century, and then really kind of coming into force in the 9th century. And so its oldest form, it unites and synthesizes early Christian kind of music and understandings of the Jewish psalmody. So a lot of the stuff that's used, especially in the Roman Rite, and unfortunately I can't speak to the Eastern Church, but this definitely could apply to them as well. But they take the Jewish psalmody that was used and they preserved it in the invitatory, the responsories, the tracts, the monastic divine office. If you guys ever pray the divine office with some of those Benedictines up in Abiquiu or something, and actually that might not be true, I haven't seen the form that they use. But for the most part, those sort of tonalities, the psalms, the stuff that you hear is over 2,000 years old. Those melodies are over 2,000 years old. And we're preserving that essence of the Jewish psalmody. And from this, early on, the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, Roman chant emerged. Or as they called it, Catilina Romana. Catilina Romana. And this is just a neat image that I pull up. It's kind of, it is a little bit of an aside, but I thought it was really cool. This is a text, O Sapientiae, by St. Hildegard von Bingen. She's pretty cool, German. She was born in 1098, died in 1179, so quite a while back. She was pretty amazing because she would actually write her own Gregorian chant. So what you're looking at here is actually first-hand written Gregorian chant by St. Hildegard von Bingen, who is the doctor of the church, declared by Pope Benedict XVI. Pretty cool individual, very headstrong. But I just thought this was a neat example because this is like really early Gregorian chant, where most musicians who are trained in modern notation, I mean, even myself and a lot of other people who are more familiar with Gregorian chant, like this is unbelievably difficult to read. Because, like I was saying earlier, they would have relative tonality. So they would write out the text, write out the whole text of O Sapientiae, and then early on they would just kind of like make like little tick marks, like this note is higher than this note is the same, you know what I mean? They're all kind of relative to one another. And then after that they drew a line, a red line across, as kind of the bass line, and then would say these ones are higher than the bass line, and they go like this, and this one goes like this, up high. And then as it progressed in the more modern notation, they started adding these different lines and then clefs and stuff. But this is just an example of a very early Gregorian chant. Not the earliest, but one of the very early Gregorian chants that emerged. So Gregorian chant, I mentioned earlier Roman chant, Catilina Romana. But why do we keep calling it Gregorian chant? It's because of this guy, Pope Gregory the Great. I love this image. If you look him up on Google Images, you find a lot of like paintings of him like studiously sitting down like with a quill in hand, like writing Gregorian chant, or you see him like holding open a Gregorian chant book with all this stuff written out. So that term comes from an early association with Pope Gregory the Great, and he lived in the 6th century. So you notice earlier I said that the chant, as we know, kind of emerges in the 7th century. So it's said that, he received the inspiration for Gregorian chant from the Holy Spirit. That could absolutely be the case. That could definitely be the case. It's a very pious and awesome belief. And so, like, we ask St. Gregory the Great for his intercession before we begin everything we sing. So it's a very pious, very venerable belief. But most scholars say the Gregorian chant, as we know it, likely emerged during the 8th century as a restoration of Roman chant by Carolingian rulers and Carolingian reformers. So there was an I won't say awesome. There was an empire, the Carolingian Empire, out of Germany. During the 8th century, Charlemagne is like one of the very noteworthy rulers of the Holy Roman Empire. They wanted to restore a lot of the things from Rome. And so they took these forms of early Roman chant, took these forms of early Jewish psalmody, and kind of fused them together and put in their own Gallican, which was the rite of the church they belonged to, their own kind of Gallican influences, their own Gallican kind of customs and stuff. And then we came out with what we have today as Gregorian chant. So by the 12th and 13th centuries, Gregorian chant had become the standard of liturgical worship and song in the Western Church. So, like earlier when I showed you O Sapientiae, although that chant is written really crazy and it's really difficult to read, it's been put into a type of chant that most chant scholars can understand and read now, and it's still, in some places, still done as a piece of sacred music. So a lot of this stuff written even during that time is still used and becomes becomes a necessary part as a text of the Mass. And so, a big thing, and I hope this isn't on your mind, but it comes up a lot in circles that I deal with around the Archdiocese, around different places, that Gregorian chant is an antiquated, just thing pre-Vatican II when pictures were in black and white, and just so antiquated. And look at all these people and Gregorian chant, and this is just a part of that antiquated, dusty kind of mentality. However, boom, Vatican II, again quoting from Sacrosanctum Concilium. Vatican II, the Reforming Council that changed everything as a lot of people understand it, said, the Church acknowledges Gregorian chant is specially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. Pride of place in liturgical services. And I always find this so ironic and so juicy. And this is a quote you should all remember. If there's anything you take away, it should be this. Because most people in what we do and what I do say that I'm trying to resurrect something of the past and trying to undermine Vatican II. Where in fact, I'm trying to actually help Vatican II with its mission. Right? So that it's essential to the Roman liturgy. It should be given pride of place in liturgical services. Or at least, an effort being made. In a lot of places, like the music director will say, Gregorian chant, I looked at it, but it's just too much. And then you talk to musicians, do you guys look at Gregorian chant? Do you guys look at the chant forms? No. Is that really giving it an honest effort to try and give it pride of place? Right? I'd say not. And so I have some misconceptions about Gregorian chant that I hear a lot, that probably some of you have heard a lot. Everybody says, hey, Gregorian chant always has to be in Latin. It actually would have been way cooler if I would have set up the buttons so that would have come up as false, but I didn't do that. So just pretend like it just comes up now. False. So false. Gregorian chant is not always in Latin. In fact, the majority of the Gregorian chants that we do in our choir, as a part of Mass, as a part of different liturgies and stuff, are actually in English. Believe it or not, they're actually in English. Let's see, I'm thinking about how to do this. Yes, okay. So Latin chant is preferred because we are the Latin Church. Obviously, it's right. So Latin chant is preferred. But it can be the case of writing in the vernacular in accord with Gregorian melodies. So a lot of these composers, there's 8 tones of Gregorian chant. They all kind of follow a similar structure. So a lot of composers in the past 50 years, I won't say a lot, excuse me, some composers in the past 50 years have taken those essential tones of Gregorian chant and the structure they follow and have applied the English translations to that. So again, I was referencing earlier Father Columba Kelly, who I had taken a workshop with in January up in Santa Fe. He, like I said, he was doing Gregorian chant in this style before it was cool. back when, nowadays at least we can talk about it and have kind of conferences like this and dialogue like this, but flashback to the 1970s, they probably they would be after you out front, So this is an example, a brief example of what he does, where he takes the Gregorian melody and applies English text to it. This text is called Today is Born, and it's from the Christmas Midnight Mass.
Today is born our Savior, Christ the Lord. Today is born our Savior, Christ the Lord. Sing to the Lord.
more reverent. I know it does for me at least. I might have a bias. But, so in that piece, you could hear very clearly the English. You could hear very clearly what they were trying to get across. That it was reverent, it was beautiful, it was a part of the essential worship of the church. So going back to this. So again, that was an example of, I put 2 down here, the St. Meinrad Psalm tones, which is what we just listened to. And that tends to be the more complex version of the Psalm tones because, like I said, Father Columba took, the really crazy Gregorian melodies that are really beautiful and he set them into English. But there's also the simple English propers, which, as it sounds, is simple. It's really easy. It took us probably, we used to get together an hour before the Mass, which most choirs do anyway, and would learn the texts. And what's easy is because there's only 8. Once you get that down, they all, for the rest of the year, just kind of fall into that pattern. So, yeah, it's unbelievably easy. There's all kinds of resources on the internet for that sort of stuff. Wait, did I skip one? Okay. Gregorian chant is hard. False. False. Does that surprise you guys? It surprised me. So Gregorian chant is not in fact hard, as I kind of just said, right? With the internet, Gregorian chant is unbelievably easy and highly accessible to many. I put up a link here. I don't even know if it's that necessary to show you guys. Maybe it is. There's this awesome website that I use to this day and that I used 5 years ago when I was learning all this stuff. Anyway, whatever, it's not pulling up. But it's CC Watershed. There it is. So CC Watershed, Corpus Christi Watershed, who did the simple English propers and really understandable notation. For people who don't read Gregorian notation, they have them in modern notation as well. Just unbelievably simple. A lot of them come with practice recording videos where you can hear the composers sing them as you can follow the melodies. So, it is not difficult. And this is coming from a guy who has no musical background, no formal music background. And I was able to know this, I was able to sing it, I'm able to do it actively as the director of a schola because of how accessible it is. That argument for Gregorian chant is hard and is inaccessible, that maybe had some ground 100 years ago when Pius X was writing Intre Sollicitudini, right? That might have held some water then, but there's also a different understanding of training for music. But that aside, there might have been some grounds for it then. Now, with the internet, it's unbelievably easy. It is unbelievably easy and accessible. False. The laity cannot fully and actively participate in Gregorian chant. False. That is false. And so before I read this text here, I'll speak briefly about the St. Meinrad psalm tones that Father Columba put out. He has you heard how all the monks came in on that big kind of chorus. So he has that, and he has sections that are sung that are really simple, easy lines for the laity, for the people in the church to sing along with. And the idea would be as well, that they have the text in front of them, so they can see what's going on, they can see what's being chanted, so they can further elevate their worship into the liturgy. Right? It's again, it's different than just a mere flourish. But going back to this, so full and active participation. We have this understanding now that if I'm sitting there and I'm not standing or sitting or kneeling or whatever, reclining, that I'm not singing, that I don't have something in front of me, that I'm not fully and actively participating in the liturgy. And that's a misunderstanding of the fundamental nature of the liturgy and the fundamental nature of full and active participation. So full and active participation does not always mean vocalizing. It is entirely possible to fully and actively participate by elevating your thoughts and senses to reflecting on the melody and the text being chanted. Here, a distinction needs to be made between internal and external participation. Internal participation is always necessary, right? You should always have your mind and your thoughts elevated to things of God and things of holy when you're in the liturgy. External participation, vocalizing movement, is only necessary sometimes. as we know, for the various motions during the Mass. But, when Father's saying the Eucharistic prayer and he's doing his priest part and I'm there on my knees, he's doing his priest part and I'm sitting there I'm kneeling there on my knees, because I'm not vocalizing, am I somehow participating less in the Mass? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Right? So we don't need to always be vocalizing, otherwise it'd sound like a bunch of sirens going off or whatever, We don't always need to be vocalizing, we don't always need to be standing and sitting doing these things to fully and actively participate. If our mind and our thoughts are elevated to things of God and things of holiness, we are fully and actively participating. Right? And this is an awesome quote I thought too from that same encyclical I can't pronounce by Pius X. And I thought this was super interesting in reading the encyclical. He says, special efforts are to be made to restore the use of Gregorian chant by the people, so that the faithful may again take a more active part in the ecclesiastical offices, as was the case in ancient times. And so this is interesting to me because he's advocating for Gregorian chant in order to help people fully and actively participate. And you think back again to the context of when this was written. If you have the 15-minute long Gloria in Excelsis Deo, with like a 40 voice chorus with all these different voices, doing all this crazy stuff and the timpani is going and everything, how are people gonna follow that? They really didn't follow that most of the time. They were there to listen to, this is how the violin was, this is, but they weren't there to follow the text. And so he's saying, getting back to Gregorian chant, getting back to these things of the church, elevating people's minds to God, infusing that together, the harmony, then we will, that the faithful will take an active part in the ecclesiastical offices, as was the case in ancient times. Again, going back to the musical tradition of the church, the understanding, the conception of the church of these sorts of things. Again, it's a great quote too. And this is a fun quote. So active participation does not preclude the active passivity of silence, stillness, and listening. Indeed, it demands it. Worshippers are not passive, for instance, when listening to the readings or homily, or following the prayers of the celebrant, and the chants and the music of the liturgy. These are experiences of silence and stillness, but they are, in their own way, profoundly active. Wow. Now I wonder who said that. Is that Pius X? It was not Pius X. It was John Paul II who said that. John Paul II, again in 2003, said that quote, that we do not need to sing all this stuff, do all this stuff, do all these crazy, flourishes. That we actively participate in the silence and the stillness and the quietness of God in the liturgy. Oh, just love that so profound. Anyway, so again, these are things that as I was constructing my talk, that I was reflecting on it, that I didn't want this sort of thing to be something that I just think is cool, that I think is beautiful, that I think belongs in liturgy. I, me, me, me. That it's not I, me, me, me. It's what the church has recommended to us, what the church has asked us to do, and unfortunately it's not happening in a lot of circles. So I just really hope that you guys can take that away from this, and these are all my different sources that I use for this. I can email this presentation to you if you guys want, if you want to use these sources using these quotes. But it's something that I'm very passionate about, obviously, not only because of my background, but just as a Catholic who wants to do what the church says. So I guess I'll do some questions. Thank you guys so much for your time. Appreciate it very much. Cool. Should we do some questions? Does anybody have any questions? I don't know. Yeah.
So with pieces like Handel's Messiah and incorporating that into the Christmas Midnight Mass, what sort of approach has the church taken, or should the church take, with taking pieces that are clearly designed for divine worship, but come from like Handel's Messiah? He was Anglican. It was developed for the Anglican Church. How do we approach those? How do we adapt them? And what's the best outlook towards them?
I would say on the sliding scale of things, and that's a slippery slope. But on the sliding scale of things, I think if we have contemporary music, contemporary stuff, that, even though it's written by an Anglican for an Anglican service, it's still a beautiful thing that for a lot of people still elevates their minds to God in the sliding scale of things. However, that still should not take the place of the Gregorian melody or the Gregorian chant or the Gregorian form. That Gregorian chant always supersedes that. The Gregorian chant should not be cut for like this long Renaissance idea of how music should be in the Mass. Again, and that's not taking anything away from it. I think I absolutely love Handel's Messiah. I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces of music that's ever been written. I've seen it several times at different occasions, and it's just blown me away. So not to take anything away from these pieces at all, but as far as again, tapping into that essential nature of what worship is, that the quote about having, the closer it is to the Gregorian melody and the Gregorian form, the closer it is to worship. And so, again, being that sliding scale, if it's Gregorian chant there with worship, and then it's, polyphony, and then it's Renaissance stuff, and then now we get to secular music. And so it all kind of begins to move away in degrees, it seems to me. So while maybe today, since that's not necessarily contemporary to our time in a strict sense, while it's better than a lot of stuff that happens in most churches, it's still not the preferred form. Does that help?
Question.
Mm-hmm.
In layman's terms, maybe even in terms that, say, a Protestant walking into this meeting might understand, without, say, any experience with the Catholic Church, how would you describe, very basically, the difference between Gregorian chant and other kinds of hymns, praise, music, etc.?
That is an inherently difficult question to ask because...
I know. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, because Gregorian chant and our understanding of Gregorian chant necessarily hinges on our understanding of liturgy and of worship. You know what I mean? So if somebody comes in without an understanding of liturgy and of worship, just even worship, where, try not to make this super, super broad, but the church says worship is sacrifice. The Mass, the Divine Liturgy, that worship is sacrifice. Right? Whereas in a lot of Protestant denominations, worship is having a praise band up there jamming away on a stage and people throwing their hands up in the air. The church would not say that that's worship. Sure, she might say that that's a form of prayer, or that's something in that vein, but that's not what worship is fundamentally. So in order to talk to them about Gregorian chant, they'd have to have an understanding of what worship is, just what worship is. But I think even still, a Protestant or somebody who doesn't belong to the church, you could play for them a Gregorian melody, and they'd say something is different about that,
Right.
something is unique about that, something is inherent about that, and it makes me feel different than something open the eyes of my heart, something right, there's something that is by nature different about it, and I might not know what that is, yeah.
But I want to clarify a little.
Yeah.
Because I've just realized that what I asked had two kind of parts to it.
Mm-hmm.
The first part, which is literally just when does music become something other than Gregorian chant, which is more just a question about what music is.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the second part of the sacredness. So as for what music is,
Yes.
what would be the basic explanation of that? When does something depart from just being Gregorian chant versus being a hymn?
Being sacred music, I mean.
Well, no, I mean,
Yeah.
apart from the sacred aspect, because I can kind of recognize something. It's oh yeah, that sounds like Gregorian chant. Oh yeah, that sounds like a hymn.
Mhm.
But literally just the music education part of it, I think I'm still a little confused as to exactly which is which sometimes.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
Well, I think, are you saying there's a difference between Gregorian chant and you have traditional Catholic hymns like Holy God, we praise thy name.
Right.
And then something like Missouri Jesuits music, praise and worship music. If it's the church tries to baptize elements of culture always, all right? Especially when it's first proclaimed in a culture. The church always tries to take something in that people know and people will respond to. But even in doing that, what Vatican II was trying to do, but it didn't happen for a lot of reasons, was to say that there are certain forms of music that are eternal, that because of what they are, Gregorian chant, Byzantine chant, Armenian classical chant, they stand out totally apart from even what we would call traditional hymns like Holy God, we praise thy name. And radically different from taking a praise band that's taking contemporary melodies, contemporary style that a contemporary kid would respond to and say, yeah, it's just like what I hear on the radio, but now it's about Jesus. And that's not what Vatican II wanted, but that's what's happened in the Roman Catholic Church in much of the world. But that wasn't the goal. And so classical church chant of East or West is something that when you hear it, you know it. You know. Just like the example you gave. You know, if an atheist walked in who has had no experience, they were raised atheists, they have no experience of worship whatsoever, and yet they know that they like listening to Gregorian chant. They like listening to classical chant from the Russian church, the Armenian church, because it lifts us out of this world and gives us a foretaste of the world to come. It's meant to be different. It was ironically classic. It was ironically contemporary at one time. It was Roman chant. It was chant used in the Diocese of Rome. It was chant used in the Jewish temple that they all knew. But even there, it was used for something different than ordinary concerts that they would have seen in their version of theaters of the ancient world.
Can I piggyback back off of that real quick?
Yeah.
Exactly what he's saying, though, as far as like if you're walking around medieval Europe, you'd hear stuff like that would sound reasonably similar to a lot of Gregorian melodies, but you'd never walk around like medieval Europe and hear like like as just what's going on in like the street corner.
As a popular song.
Yeah, like that just didn't happen. It was never secular. Like yes, they'd have secular hymns or secular things to the Virgin Mary. Like we were listening to Angelus ad Virginem the other day, which is 700 years old, right? But that was never done in the church. Similarly, Gregorian chant wasn't done on the street corner. And also there's Gregorian chants like as a part of the liturgy. So if you look in like a Roman missal, it'll have like the entrance antiphon. It'll say the text in English, or it'll have even the text in Latin in a lot of cases. And if you look up that text in Latin, it pulls up the Gregorian chant of that Latin. So there's like clearly defined terms of like what Gregorian chant is for the liturgy. It's pretty clear, and unfortunately that wasn't something that I focused on in this because I was intending more broader strokes, but that there is like strictly, this is the realm of Gregorian chant, and then what happened after that is they took, some composers would take like some musicians and have them sing a fourth above or a fourth below and things like that and structure the organum sense, and the organum is the same texts just with different kind of harmonies going on. Out of that developed polyphony, which is the same texts just with different voices singing different parts at the same time. So there is like strictly defined, like this is sacred polyphony, this is sacred Gregorian chant, this is sacred because it's text from the Mass set to music, rather than things that are kind of like ethereal, like hymns, that somebody could just write and then publish and then say, yes, this is a hymn I produced. Right? Does that kind of set up some kind of boundary?
I mean, like, there are other chants, as sorry, Reverend
Father Chris,
Father
yeah.
Chris mentioned. There are other chants. So I'm not. I feel like I should be more educated in my faith than I am. But when I hear other kinds of chant other than Gregorian, often in Mass, is that from the Church's standpoint as sacred as Gregorian?
I would not know how to answer that without hearing it, because there's a lot of stuff that somebody could say, oh, that's a chant, but that's not Gregorian chant. But that's unclear. Do you know what I mean? So I would hate to say yes, that's not Gregorian chant, or yes, it is Gregorian chant, without hearing it or seeing the text. So I don't know if with the information that I would be able to answer your question. Ralph had something, I think, though.
I was just going to ask a clarifying point on your question, but I think you guys kind of answered more. I was going to ask, though, are you asking the distinction between chant and like hymns from a purely musical standpoint? Like what makes those different forms of singing?
I asked that first, I think. Yeah,
Did that get
I mean,
answered?
that was kind of part of my question. I mean, you kind of hold notes, right? And you usually
Well,
don't have musical accompaniment.
That's one key.
Yeah, it's
is you
usually
never
a cappella,
have- Right,
right.
you never, yeah, you don't usually have musical accompaniment.
Kind of. The organ began to make its way back into it when it needed to support some of the voices as a method, as a means of supporting.
Right.
So that's not super strict. I mean, a cappella generally that's how you're going to recognize it for the most part. Like, but in like the later medieval times, it was brought in to add a depth to some of the voices where they still kept the chant but added some notes on the organ to fill in some blank spaces. And I know this is getting kind of vague, but yeah, without more information, I don't know if I could adequately answer that question.
But to go a little
Yeah.
further, like just like some basic details, what separates chant and like especially contemporary hymns, is a lot of stuff Will said in his early part. The Gregorian chant, it's relative tonality. So like when you see a dot or a nu, sometimes what it's called, that's not like, oh, that's an E, that's an F. It's more relative than that. And also, there's no specific time signature. There's no like count. There's no downbeats in Gregorian chant. It's more of the tones, and each tone has like a flow to it. Whereas you can pick up contemporary hymns, find the key signature, find the tempo, find the time, and you sing it in time. Whereas time signatures, specific tones, specific notes aren't found in Gregorian chant. So like that's some technical side of it a little bit. I don't know if that helps you a little bit more.
Even in modern text, though. Even in
Gregorian
modern
chant
text, there's
texts.
not a time signature to.
That's correct. Even in modern Gregorian chant, or at least modern notation of Gregorian chant, there's still no time signature. There's still it's still relative tonality.
Which is always funny because, like I said, like we kind of learned Gregorian chant. Like, I mean, he has more of a background in music even than I do, but you know, like I just learned to start at whatever note's comfortable, which sometimes for me would be really high because I'm a high tenor. But you know, like we'll chant with some very formally trained musicians, and they'll have a really hard time doing that. It's like, what's the starting note? Well, how about ah? It's like, oh no, well, like what note is that? They'll be messing around on like the piano trying to figure out what note that is, so they can write it in there, even though we're not going to hit that note going in, but just so it's on their page. You know what I mean? So, and that's a total aside. It's a funny story.
One thing that's interesting is Gregorian chant albums consistently are top 5 every year of music charts.
New York.
So many people in the church threw it out, and yet people are starving for it. And obscure monasteries become famous because somebody goes in and records the nuns or the monks chanting, and everybody wants to hear it all over the planet. You know, it's amazing.
Totally.
It speaks so clearly to people's hearts. You know, even people who are unchurched in countries like France, you know, where only 5% of people go to Mass on Sunday. But that's the most popular music always on the French music charts is Gregorian chant.
There's something inherent about it, totally.
Yeah.
I was just commenting that the New York Polyphony is an amazing polyphonic group out of New York. They just like made it into Billboard's like top 5 for the year. They released a new album a couple months ago, Roma Eterna, and it just like went totally crazy and top 5 like the world. So it's pretty cool. So yeah, there's something inherent about it, totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's meant to lift us out of this world and open the door to the next. That's really what chant is meant to do.
Yeah, totally. Any other questions?
Okay.